The reception had been planned down to the final glass, greeting, and ceremonial step. Yet the moment Queen Camilla lowered herself into the seat reserved beside King Charles, Princess Anne pushed back her chair, rose without explanation, and walked out of Buckingham Palace's grand reception. Conversations stopped. Charles stared after his sister. Camilla remained frozen. Everyone understood that Anne's departure was not an accident. It was a message. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne had entered composed and determined to perform her duty. She greeted Commonwealth representatives, spoke with Prince William, and acknowledged Catherine before taking the chair assigned to her 2 places from the king. The Commonwealth is the association of nations linked by history and cooperation, making the gathering more than ceremony. It was a display of unity, hierarchy, and trust inside the monarchy. Camilla was expected to remain on Charles's opposite side. Instead, she moved towards the chair beside him and sat without hesitation. Anne watched, then looked at her brother. Disappointment replaced anger. She folded the printed program, placed it on the table, and rose. The Princess Royal, a title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, offered no excuse, no explanation, and no backward glance as she left. Charles felt the room tighten. Every guest had seen the exchange, yet he did not call Anne back. The king remained seated, caught between the wife beside him and the sister walking away. Camilla gripped the edge of her chair. She forced herself to stay still as attention shifted towards her, realizing that a seating change had become a test of whether her authority was respected or feared. A senior equerry moved towards the table after Anne disappeared. An equerry is a royal aide who assists senior family members at official duties. He lifted the seating card and discovered it had been printed less than 40 minutes before the reception, even though Charles's approved order had placed Anne beside him. William saw another aide reach for the card and slide it beneath a folder, as though hiding evidence. The prince said nothing, but his expression hardened. Catherine followed his gaze towards the concealed card. Charles leaned towards his private secretary and ordered him to find Anne before she reached the palace gates. The answer returned moments later. She had entered her car, refused to come back, and left Buckingham Palace behind. Anne's empty chair became the most powerful presence in the room. But to understand why she abandoned a lifetime of royal discipline, the loyalties binding Anne, Charles, and Camilla must first be pulled apart. To outsiders, the confrontation appeared to concern nothing more than a chair. Inside the family, that chair represented decades of sacrifice, rivalry, loyalty, and resentment. Anne had protected Charles when the monarchy seemed fragile. Camilla had fought to secure her place beside him. Now both women believed they were defending the crown, and Charles stood between them, unable to honor one without appearing to betray the other. Anne had spent most of her life doing what duty demanded, without asking whether anyone noticed. She accepted exhausting schedules, difficult visits, and thankless responsibilities because the crown, the institution built around the monarch and the royal family's public service, depended on reliability more than applause. The Princess Royal rarely demanded affection or ceremonial reward. Yet that silence had created a dangerous assumption that she would accept anything without protest. Camilla carried a different wound. Years of public rejection had made every chair, title, and position feel like proof that she finally belonged beside Charles. Before the reception, the Queen Consort told a trusted dresser during a private conversation that Anne's coldness made her feel permanently judged. As the woman fastened a bracelet around her wrist, she said she would no longer apologize for occupying the place the king had given her. Camilla believed she was defending her legitimacy. She did not realize Anne believed she was expanding it. William had sensed the conflict before either woman entered the room. During a private exchange that afternoon, Anne told him she could tolerate ambition, but she would not tolerate agreed protocol being rewritten without authority. Protocol means the formal rules deciding where royals sit, stand, and perform official duties. The prince understood her warning was not aimed at Camilla's presence. It was aimed at the growing belief that proximity to Charles gave his wife control over everyone around him. Charles sat alone after the reception, holding the program Anne had abandoned. He ran his thumb across the hard crease she had pressed into the paper, then placed it beside Camilla's untouched glass. The king said nothing. Silence had protected him during countless public storms, but now it felt like cowardice. William later learned through a documented briefing from the senior equerry that Anne had never objected to Camilla sitting prominently. Her anger centered entirely on the last-minute removal of the arrangement Charles had already approved. Catherine then recalled in a private conversation with her husband that she had seen the Queen's private secretary carrying a revised seating folder shortly before the doors opened. That detail changed everything. Anne's departure had not been born in one reckless second. It had been building since an earlier ceremony, when another quiet alteration convinced her that someone was deliberately testing how much she would endure. The reception exposed the wound, but the injury itself had been inflicted weeks earlier, during a ceremony that Anne would later describe as the moment trust inside the palace finally broke. 3 weeks before Anne walked out, the family gathered at Windsor for a private military remembrance ceremony. The event was meant to honor service, sacrifice, and continuity. Instead, one altered instruction placed Camilla at the center of a tribute Anne had spent months preparing. Anne said nothing before the guests. But in the deserted corridor afterwards, a brief exchange with Camilla turned private frustration into a line neither woman could cross. Anne had worked on the ceremony for months, speaking with veterans representatives and senior household officials to make sure every name, tribute, and promise of remembrance carried real meaning. The Princess Royal's connection to the armed forces had never been ceremonial alone. She had spent years supporting serving personnel and military families, which made the final wreath more than a formal gesture. A wreath-laying ceremony is a public act of remembrance in which flowers are placed to honor those who served and died. Charles had approved the original order himself. Anne would place the final wreath and stand beside him during the closing tribute. Minutes before the ceremony reached its most solemn moment, an aide approached Anne with a revised program. Camilla would now carry the final wreath. The Queen Consort would also take the position beside Charles, while his sister would step backwards into the second line. No one had warned her. No one offered an explanation. Anne felt the insult immediately, but she refused to disrupt a tribute built around veterans rather than royal pride. She followed the altered order, stood behind Camilla, and kept her expression controlled until the final words were spoken. The monarch remained unaware that anything had changed, while his wife accepted the central position as though it had always belonged to her. The corridor emptied quickly after the guests moved away. Anne removed her gloves, approached Camilla, and asked in a low voice, "Did you request that change?" The Queen did not deny it. She answered that the monarch's wife should not appear visibly secondary at a ceremony attended by the king. Anne held her gaze. "Service is not the same thing as rank," she replied. Camilla stiffened, hearing judgment in every word. She believed Anne had never fully accepted her place beside Charles. His sister saw something more dangerous. A ceremonial role had been rewritten not through discussion, but through pressure hidden behind royal authority. The truth emerged later in a documented review of the ceremony papers. Charles's signature remained on the original plan, but the revised version had been circulated under the authority of Camilla's household office. He had never approved the alteration. Anne later told William during a private conversation that the wreath itself was not the real issue. The prince listened as she explained that someone had changed protocol in Charles's name without consulting him. When the same pattern appeared at Buckingham Palace, another revised plan, another privileged position, another missing conversation, she recognized the chair beside the king as Windsor happening again. Anne had remained silent after Windsor, but Buckingham Palace forced the conflict into the open, and before the night ended, Charles would bring the two women together for a confrontation no aide was permitted to witness. Anne returned to the palace only after Charles sent a personal message rather than an official summons. She entered through a private doorway and found Camilla waiting beside the king. No secretaries, no equerries, no prepared explanations. Charles placed both seating plans on the table and asked one direct question: Did you move Anne's place? What followed was not a discussion about protocol. It was a family reckoning. Charles had chosen the smaller sitting room because the dispute could not survive another audience. Competing accounts were already moving between royal households, and once those versions reached staff, the conflict would become harder to contain. A royal household is the team of private secretaries, aides, and advisors supporting each senior family member. The king wanted the truth before any office began protecting itself. Anne agreed to return because her brother contacted her personally. She entered still wearing the clothes from the reception, but the insignia pinned to her earlier had been removed. Royal insignia are formal badges and decorations showing rank or service. Without them, she was not presenting herself as the Princess Royal demanding recognition. She was a sister demanding honesty. Charles placed the original seating plan beside the revised version. His hand remained flat against the papers as he looked towards Camilla. "Did your office move Anne's place?" Camilla held his gaze and answered without hesitation. She had approved the change because the Queen should sit beside the King. Her voice was controlled, but the admission landed heavily. Anne did not interrupt. She waited until the silence became unbearable. "The seat was never the insult," she said. "The insult was using his authority for a decision he never made." Camilla's restraint finally broke. She accused Anne of treating her like a temporary visitor in every room they shared. The Queen Consort said she had spent years entering palaces where every pause, every stare, and every cold greeting reminded her that she was still considered an outsider. She had stopped apologizing for standing beside Charles. Anne leaned forward. Taking power quietly, she warned, did not make the action dignified. It only made the betrayal harder to see. Charles then revealed what neither woman expected him to say. A documented review had confirmed that the Windsor wreath order was also changed without his approval. The king had examined both sets of papers, spoken with the relevant aides, and found the same pattern twice. Camilla's face changed. She could no longer dismiss the two incidents as confusion. Anne removed her palace access card and placed it on the table. The card allowed her entry through private royal areas without repeated clearance. She warned that she would withdraw from selected receptions if Camilla's office continued changing arrangements under Charles's name. Charles did not defend either woman. He picked up the card, closed his hand around it, and said every household authority would be reviewed before morning. The confrontation ended without reconciliation, but Charles's promised review carried consequences far greater than one damaged relationship, because it would reveal who truly controlled decisions made in the king's name. By sunrise, Charles's private secretary had assembled a narrow red file containing revised programs, seating plans, ceremonial instructions, and handwritten approvals. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Camilla's office had repeatedly expanded its authority through changes too small to attract public attention, but significant enough to reshape the palace hierarchy. Charles opened the file, expecting administrative carelessness. What he found felt like a breach of personal trust. Charles understood how easily palace power could hide inside routine paperwork. Separate royal households manage schedules, guest lists, ceremonial roles, and precedents. The formal order deciding who stands, sits, or enters first at official events. Camilla held legitimate control over her own program, but any change affecting Anne, William, or another senior royal required consultation. Sensitive alterations needed the king's direct approval, because one unnoticed decision could send a larger message about rank and influence. The morning clock struck as Charles reached the Windsor revision. He removed his glasses, pressed his fingers against his eyes, and remained motionless behind the desk. The original plan carried his approval. The replacement did not. Yet the revised document had still moved through the palace, as though the monarch himself had ordered it. Charles felt the conflict closing around him. Protecting Camilla had become almost instinctive after years of watching her face public rejection. He knew how quickly any criticism of his wife could become humiliation. But Anne's loyalty had also been taken for granted precisely because she rarely complained. His sister had served without demanding praise, and that silence had allowed others to assume she would never resist. Camilla waited in the adjoining room while the review continued. She paced once, then stopped herself, fearing every movement might reveal panic. The Queen Consort understood that a procedural review, a formal examination of how decisions were made, could become something far more personal. If Charles concluded that her office had abused his authority, the finding would not merely limit her staff, it would cast doubt over her judgment inside the family. The red file then exposed a deeper pattern. 3 disputed changes had originated with the same deputy private secretary, an aide responsible for turning senior instructions into official arrangements. In a documented account prepared for the king, the official explained that he believed Camilla expected never to appear subordinate during ceremonies attended by Charles. A handwritten note complicated the truth. It showed that Camilla knew about 2 alterations, including Windsor, but gave no clear sign that she understood her husband's approval had been bypassed. Intention and execution had become tangled together. She had encouraged the outcome, while someone else had silently expanded the method. Charles lifted his pen and signed a temporary order. From that moment, every ceremonial change crossing between royal households required his written consent. Camilla's office lost its freedom to act alone. Charles had restored control on paper, but signatures could not contain the emotional shock that followed, as Camilla faced diminished authority and Anne confronted the cost of forcing her brother to choose. The new order reached senior staff before breakfast. By mid-morning, every royal office understood what it meant. Camilla's household could no longer alter shared ceremonial plans without the king's written approval. No public announcement was issued, yet the message moved through the palace with brutal speed. Anne had walked out for less than a minute, but that minute had redrawn boundaries that courtiers had spent years pretending did not exist. Charles froze all upcoming reception plans and ordered disputed instructions to be reviewed line by line. Household staff were warned that his authority could no longer be invoked without written confirmation. A royal office is the group of aides and private secretaries managing a senior family member's duties, and the new restriction struck directly at how those offices had operated for years. Every altered seat, procession order, and ceremonial role now carried the risk of scrutiny. The palace divided almost immediately. Some courtiers believed Anne had protected the monarch from decisions made in his name. Others felt she had humiliated Camilla in front of guests over a conflict that should have remained private. No one spoke openly, but doors closed faster. Conversations ended when unfamiliar staff entered, and loyalty became visible in silence. Camilla received the written order at breakfast. She read the first paragraph twice, placed the page beside her untouched tea, and dismissed the room before anyone could see her composure collapse. The Queen Consort felt punished not only for the altered chair, but for every old controversy still attached to her name. Her anger moved from Anne to the cautious courtiers, then back to Charles for signing the restriction, before giving her another private chance to explain. Anne felt no triumph at Gatcombe Park. She removed the brooch worn at the reception, placed it carefully inside its case, and admitted to her husband during a private conversation that walking out may have wounded her brother more deeply than she intended. The Princess Royal still believed the boundary had to be defended, but the cost no longer felt abstract. Charles had been forced to choose in public because she had refused to remain silent in private. William called before midday. He warned Anne that several courtiers were preparing competing accounts of the reception, each version designed to protect a different household. The prince understood that once those stories escaped the palace, the family would lose control of the meaning behind her departure. Charles then rejected a proposal to describe Anne's exit as illness or fatigue. The king ordered that no false explanation be circulated, surprising both sides with his refusal to bury the conflict beneath a convenient excuse. Instead of arranging another formal meeting, he asked his sister to meet him alone in the palace garden. The machinery of the monarchy had already responded, but the future of the family now depended on a brother and sister speaking not as sovereign and princess, but as two people who feared they had finally failed one another. Charles waited in the palace garden without an aide or folder in sight. Anne arrived expecting another argument, but her brother did not ask her to apologize. He asked why she had looked at him before leaving. That question stripped away the protocol, the altered plans, and Camilla's disputed authority. Anne's answer revealed that the deepest wound had never been the chair. It was her fear that Charles no longer recognized her loyalty. Charles walked beside her along the secluded path where they had once played as children, before rank made every conversation heavier. Neither used a formal title. The crown, the institution formed around the sovereign and the royal family's public duties, had turned even simple disagreements into matters of national consequence. Yet on that path, he was not speaking as the king. He was an elder brother trying to understand why his sister had looked so devastated. Anne stopped when he repeated the question. During their private conversation, she admitted that she had looked directly at Charles because she needed to know whether he understood what was happening. When he remained silent, she believed he had either approved the change or no longer cared enough to challenge it. The departure was not intended to punish him. It was the only answer she felt she had left. Charles absorbed the words without defending himself. Anne told him she had spent her entire life protecting the monarchy through service, restraint, and loyalty. Lately, however, that loyalty seemed valuable only when it remained quiet, obedient, and convenient. She could survive losing a seat. What she could not accept was watching his authority used while everyone expected her to endure the insult silently. Charles finally admitted his failure. Years of public hostility towards Camilla had made him believe he must protect his wife from every challenge. He had treated criticism as cruelty, before asking whether some warnings were justified. By shielding the queen consort from every difficult truth, the monarch had failed to see when her office crossed a boundary. Anne made her position clear. She did not want Camilla humiliated, stripped of her role, or pushed from Charles's side. She wanted one rule restored. No royal office should manufacture the king's approval or use his name to pressure another family member. Her dispute concerned trust, not revenge. Charles reached into his coat and returned Anne's palace access card. He asked her not to withdraw from royal duties, reminding her that the institution still needed the strength she had given it for decades. She accepted the card, but only after he promised to speak honestly with Camilla, enforce the restrictions, and protect his wife's dignity while doing so. That evening, Charles entered Camilla's private room alone. He carried no red file and no official order. In his hand rested only the original seating card bearing Anne's name. Anne and Charles had repaired the bond beneath the crown, but reconciliation would remain incomplete until Camilla faced what the altered chair had cost her, and what she was prepared to surrender to restore trust. By the following morning, the palace's carefully guarded silence had been defeated by one photograph. Anne's empty chair, beside a visibly unsettled king, while Camilla sat rigidly on his other side. The image spread faster than any official explanation. To some, Anne had defended royal integrity. To others, she had humiliated the queen. Yet behind the headlines, 3 members of one family were attempting to prevent a private wound from becoming a national fracture. Broadcasters reconstructed the departure minute by minute. Reception footage showed Anne rising, Charles watching her leave, and an aide removing the abandoned place card almost immediately. Guest accounts confirmed that no illness had been mentioned before she walked out. Palace communications staff, the officials responsible for explaining royal events to the public, released a restrained statement confirming that the Princess Royal had left early and that internal arrangements were being reviewed. They refused to create a medical excuse. The Chronicle captured the national mood with one brutal front page. Beneath a full-width image of the empty chair, the headline declared, "The seat that shook the palace." A silent gesture had become the defining symbol of the dispute. The story no longer concerned only who sat beside Charles. It now raised a far more damaging question. Could authority inside the monarchy be changed without the monarch's knowledge? Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered near the gates. An elderly veteran held a handwritten sign reading, "Service deserves respect," defending Anne's long military commitment. Another visitor argued that Camilla should not be publicly undermined after spending years earning acceptance. Their disagreement reflected the nation's division. One side saw courage, the other saw cruelty. William watched the live coverage beside Catherine. The prince heard commentators reduce the family into rival factions, as though one woman had to win and the other had to fall. Catherine reminded him that public pressure could harden private pride. Before entering a palace meeting, he looked at her and said quietly, "Somebody has to stop trying to win." She understood that he feared the argument could damage Charles as much as either woman. The palace then confirmed that future ceremonial changes would require unified written approval. The new process meant senior households had to agree formally before shared duties or positions could be altered. It validated Anne's objection without naming Camilla as the offender. Camilla chose not to resist. Through a written instruction sent by her private secretary, the Queen Consort ordered that Anne's military and ceremonial responsibilities must never again be changed without direct consultation. She then wrote a personal invitation asking her sister-in-law to return to Buckingham Palace for a private conversation in the room where the disputed seating plan had been prepared. The world had already chosen heroes and villains, but inside the palace, Anne and Camilla were about to reject that simple judgment and decide whether one empty chair would divide them permanently or force an overdue truth. Anne entered the room where the reception plan had been changed and found 2 chairs placed opposite each other. Camilla was already waiting. There was no king between them, no courtier to soften the language, and no ceremony requiring either woman to pretend. The Queen placed the original seating card on the table and admitted that her determination to secure respect had caused her to disregard the respect Anne had already earned. Camilla spoke first. Years of scrutiny had convinced her that surrendering any visible position would be treated as proof that she remained an outsider, even after becoming queen. That title meant she stood beside the sovereign as his wife and senior royal partner, yet she had allowed its symbols to become a defense against every insecurity. She told Anne during their private conversation that fear had shaped decisions she once believed were acts of strength. Anne listened without interrupting. She admitted that her reserve had never made Camilla's acceptance easy, but she drew a firm line between personal distance and denying her rightful place beside Charles. The Princess Royal had never wanted the Queen Consort removed or diminished. She wanted duty protected from quiet interference, because once royal authority could be borrowed without permission, trust itself became meaningless. Camilla slid the original seating card towards her and apologized for approving the change without speaking to her first. Anne did not take it immediately. Silence settled between them before she finally folded the card once and placed it at the center of the table. The gesture carried no triumph. It marked an agreement that neither woman would erase what had happened. Anne then apologized for walking out without warning Charles. She admitted that her decision forced her brother to absorb the public consequences of a conflict he had not fully understood. Camilla accepted the apology and confirmed that the new approval restrictions would remain. Her title and office would never again be used to silence consultation, while Anne agreed to attend the next formal reception. Charles later formalized the revised household process through a permanent written order. The procedure required shared ceremonial decisions to receive clear approval from every affected royal office. Camilla retained her dignity and place beside the king, while his sister's military and ceremonial duties gained protection from unilateral changes. The next reception delivered the final answer. Camilla entered first, reached Anne's assigned chair, and paused. The Princess Royal arrived, met her eyes, and sat. Only then did the Queen take her own place beside Charles. Anne's walkout had never been a rebellion against the monarchy. It was a refusal to let loyalty become invisibility. Camilla's apology did not weaken her queenship. It strengthened it by separating true authority from insecure control. Charles learned that avoiding conflict only allows resentment to deepen. His wife learned that belonging cannot be secured by taking space from someone else. His sister learned that justified defiance can still wound those she loves. There was no further confrontation, and no unfinished battle. Only 3 people returning to their duties with clearer boundaries, altered trust, and the knowledge that one silent departure had forced the crown to become honest with itself. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe.